Good morning. Today's daf is daf Memchet. We are near the bottom of Mem Zion Amabet. Let's see, we're at Amar of Nachman, which is second to last line on Mem Zion Amabet. And we are again continuing our discussion of the lungs of a potentially kosher animal to determine whether or not the defects in those lungs are sufficiently serious such that the animal will be considered a treifa, meaning that it will not be kosher. So even though the type of animal is a kosher animal, this particular animal will not be kosher. So Amar of Nachman, again, second line, five words from the end of the line. Amar of Nachman, Reya, the lungs, Shenimoka ukrum shela kayam kshera. If it is, if its membrane, I'm sorry, if it decays, meaning some of it disappears. Take a look at Rashi. Nimoka, nisurokna, becomes empty. Me'aleha miktsasa. Ve'ena nishbacha ketone. So the case that we dealt with at the end of the day yesterday is where the insides all turn to mush and can pour out. Here, it's not that the insides turn to mush, but they sort of disappear. Excuse me. Ach b'miktsasa lo nishar klum. To some extent, it is totally missing. There's a piece of it that's totally missing. So, what is the story there? So, as long as the krumshela, the membrane that is around it, is still in existence, kshera, then it is kosher. So Tanya Nami Hachi, and we actually have a brisa that supports this idea. Reya shenimoka, if you have a lung that has, part of it has become empty, it's decayed, ukrum shela kayam, but the outer membrane of the lungs remain. Afilu machzekes revius, even if what has disappeared is large enough to hold a revius. And Rashi points out, afilu machzekes chalal chisaron, the whole of what is missing. Hamaxik revius halug, and it can hold a quarter log of any kind of liquid. Kshera, the animal is kosher. Nitla, as we turn to Memchet Amud Aleph, Shalpuches Shala, Kshera. If the Shalpuches, and Rashi tells us, because we're talking about various sacs within the body, Krum Shavlad Munachba. This is the uterus,
Uterus.
exactly, or womb. And so, as a result, if that is removed, well, then again, it would the kshera, the animal would still be kosher. Hitliya kaved shala, if the tolaim worms get into the liver, zehayamaisa, that actually once happened. Va'alu aleha b'nei Asya shalosh regalim liyavne, and the children, the people of Asya came three times to Yavne in an effort to get the Sanhedrin there to rule, and the regel shlishi hitiruha lahem, and on the third time they said it was permitted. Okay, so but the point of citing that brisa was for the first comment, the fact that exactly as Rav Nachman said, a lung that has decayed and now has something missing is going to be kosher. So Amar of Yosef Bar Manyumi, Amar of Nachman, Reya hasmucha ledofin ein choshishin la, that if you have a lung that has become smucha, connected, adhering to the walls of the chest cavity, ain choshishin la, we do not worry about there being a hole there. Now, why would we worry? So Rashi helps us out. Ain choshishin la, Shema nikva, maybe there's a hole, top of the narrow lines in Rashi on Memchet Amud Aleph, and keep your finger on Rashi so that we can go back and forth between them because we'll be doing the next several. So Shema Nikva, maybe there's a hole. Elatalinan Riusa Bedofin. What we say is, yeah, there might be a hole, but that hole was likely going to be in the wall of the chest cavity, and the hole in the wall of the chest cavity is not sufficient to make an animal a treifa. V'amrinan dofen zeh makahaita. There was a wound in the chest cavity, haita bo, v'keshechaita, and when it got better, kalta haria etzla. The lung got connected to it. And so that's what happened. And so, given that we can have this other justification for why the lung is adhering to the chest cavity, so that's why we don't need to be worried about it. Helsa tzmachim, but Rav Nachman continues that if there are a bunch of blisters around it, and Rashi clarifies helta hariya, if the lung developed these blisters, well then, and smachin, Rashi says, minalans svivot smichta, that around where it is attached to the ledoven, to the wall of the chest cavity, that's where these blisters developed. Hoil v'chazinan ba riusa. Now that we actually see some kind of negative impact, talin and lamaka bida. Now we have to be worried that maybe the wound is not on the chest cavity, but rather on the lung itself. And if there's a wound on the lung, again, that would make it a treifa. So that's why Rav Nachman distinguishes between the two cases. When there's nothing that's obviously wrong with the lung, well, then we can say that this is most likely going to be the wall of the chest cavity that has the hole and not the lung, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. But once we see the blisters around where the lungs are attached to the chest cavity, now we have to be worried that maybe it is the lungs that have the problem, and therefore we would be concerned about it. Mar Yehuda Mishmei da Avimi Amar. Mar Yehuda says, you know what? You know what? Even in the case where it's just adhering to the wall of the chest cavity, that is enough for me to be concerned, even when there aren't necessarily any blisters. So, Hechi Avdinan, what do you do in these respective cases? Meaning, whether you're saying, according to Rav Nachman, that when you're concerned because there are blisters, or according to Avimi, even when there are no blisters, what do we do in order to evaluate? Meaning, worried is not the same thing as saying it's definitely a treifa. So, Amarava Ravin Bar Shaba Asperali. I'm sorry, Amarava Ravin Bar Shaba Asperali. Rava said that Ravin Bar Shaba explained this to me. What did he say? My tinan sakina dechalish pume. We bring a knife with a thin mouth, meaning a thin edge to it. So, and Rashi tells us next Rashi one, two, three, six, 7 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. Dechalish pume, piyu chadud. It's a sharp point. Vidak and thin. V'chosech yafa, and it cuts really well. Shelo yikareya karum hariya, so that the membrane, outer membrane of the lungs will not tear as a result of bimoshcho osam min hadofin, when you pull it away from the wall. And so what do we do? So now that we've got this sharp knife, back into the Gemara, umifarkin la. We're 1 second. Where are we? We're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines down in the Gemara. Umifarkin la. We separate the lung from the wall. Well, if we see that there's actually a problem, there was a hole in the chest wall, well, then that's going to be we say that that's the cause of the connection, and therefore the animal will be kosher. Ve'ilo machmas um, V'lo machmas rei v'ilo, and if we don't see a problem with the chest wall, machmas reyahu, it's the result um uh, uh of a problem with the lung. So that is our explanation. And so as utrefa, and it will be considered a trefa. Now, the next words, the hagos habach removes, and there are going to be, we can read it both with and without those words and come up with two different alternatives. The box suggests that Rashi probably also doesn't have these words because of the way Rashi is going to interpret what comes next. So we'll skip these words for the moment, and then we'll offer another interpretation. Rav Nechemia brave to Rav Yosef badek bifarshore. Whereas Rav Nechemia would say that you need to check the lungs. That in addition to, well, let's read Rashi. Badek bifshure, that we're going to check the lungs in lukewarm water. As we've seen previously, you inflate them and put them in lukewarm water to see whether there are any holes. So Rashi tells us, this is the next Rashi. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi. La'achar shepir kua umatzao maka bedofet. Even in the situation where you removed it and you found a wound in the wall, menafeyach we blow into the lungs, maya trefa shahari nikva, and we check to see whether or not there will be any bubbling that would indicate that the lungs have a hole in them. And so Rashi says that Reb Nechemia is effectively more strict than the position that Rabbah was quoting from Rabban Bar Shaba, because Rabban Bar Shaba said basically, as long as we see a defect in the walls of the chest cavity, well, then we're not going to say that it's from a hole in the lung. We'll blame it on the chest cavity, and the animal will be kosher. And Reb Nechemia says, no, even in that situation, once we have some suspicion associated with the lung, we need to inflate it and put it in lukewarm water to check to see whether any air is escaping. Okay. And whereas if we were to now go back and read this piece, the prior words of the that were taken out, let's go back and do that. So go back to the Aleph, and we say the afal gav delo kamat gazika, and when we say that the lung is a treifa, we say it even though there's no air escaping. Well, now all of a sudden, if we have those words in the Gemara, Rav Nechemia becomes completely different, because now Rav Nechemia is clearly commenting on that language, because the idea is that according to Rab and Bar Shaba, the only time you would that this animal would be a treifa, and we would attribute the hole to be in the lungs, even if we don't see any air escaping, if we were to do the test that Reb Nechemia says. Whereas Reb Nechemia would say, no, you do the test, and if the test passes, so then you don't have to worry about it being a treifa, even if you don't see anything wrong with the walls of the cavity of the chest cavity. And so as a result, those are the two different ways that we can understand Rav Nechemia's response. either like Rashi, removing the words and saying that Rav Nechemia is actually stricter than Rav and Bar Shaba, or we can understand Rav Nechemia as saying he's more lenient to Rav and Bar Shaba, because Rav and Bar Shaba will say that you have a treifa when you don't see anything wrong with the chest wall. So we're going to automatically assume that there's something wrong with the lungs. And Rav Nechemia says, no, you have to at least check the lungs to see whether or not there's something wrong. Okay, so those are the two different ways that we can understand that Gemara. Back into the Gemara. So
So in the latter sense, he would say that if the wall is normal, you cannot assume that it is a treifa.
If according to Reb Nechemia, that's exactly right. Just because the wall is normal in the latter explanation, you cannot assume that it's a treifa. That's a contradiction to exactly what Rav and Bar Shaba says. Rav and Bar Shaba says you see nothing wrong with the walls of the chest cavity. By definition, it must be a treifa. Where Reb Nechemia says, under that explanation, no, you got to at least check the lung. If you don't see any hole in the lung, so we might not have a great explanation, but it's not going to change the nature of the animal. We're going to still have it be a kosher animal. So, all right. So now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 lines down in the Gemara. The first word on the line. Amrle Marzutra, Bray de Rav Huna, Bray de Rav Papi, La Ravina. So Marzutra says to Ravina, Ha de Rav Nechemia, Bray de Rav Yosef, Atun Ahamas Nisula. Right? So this ruling of Rav Nechemia, the son of Rabbi Yosef, namely that we need to test to see whether or not the lung has air escaping when you put it in lukewarm water. You just taught it in connection with the case of a lung that's connected to the chest wall. Anan adarava masninan la. But I learned it with respect to a different ruling of Rava. De Amar Rava, Hani tarte une dureya desirichan lahadadi. That when you have two lobes that are connected to one another, leis lahu bedikusa lakshure. There is no way to check it to see whether or not it's kosher. And remember that we said in this context that the two lobes that we're talking about are not adjacent to one another. If they are adjacent to one another, well, then they can actually support each other, and that hole would not necessarily be a problem. But when they are not adjacent to one another, the hole that has been clogged up by their connecting to one another, even though they're not adjacent, is likely to reopen because these are not adjacent. And so as the animal moves, the hole will reopen. So it's only in that case where Rav Nechemia braid Rav Yosef badik lai b'pashure that Rav Nechemia would say, being more lenient, he would say, nah, you don't, even when they're not adjacent, take a look and see whether any air escapes. If no air escapes, even if the lobes that have connected are not adjacent to one another, we're still going to say that this is a kosher animal. So Maskif lo Rav Ashi objected to this. Hi mai, how could you possibly say that? Bishlama hacha talinam bidofen ukshera. When we have the possibility that when the things that are connected are the wall cavity and the lung. Well, okay, at least we can say that why are they connected? They're connected because of because there was a problem with the wall cavity. But when you have your example, Aval Hasam, but there where there are two lobes that are connected, whichever side, whichever lobe it is that has the hole that is causing the pus to come out and thereby connect the two lobes together, that the animal will definitely still be a treifa, because it doesn't make a difference which lobe there's a hole on, the animal will be a treifa. And so as a result, that objection seems to stand, and it seems that the statement of Rav Nechemia must have been in the context in which we learned it initially, namely where the lung is attached to the wall cavity, not where the two lobes of the lungs are attached to each other. Okay. Now, we had Rav Nachman ruling that if the lung is connected to the chest cavity and chest wall and it has blisters, that's where we have to be concerned. So the bottom line is, and if it turns out that the lung is what had the hole, well, then the animal will be a treifa. So umi amar Rav Nachman hachi. Is it really true that Rav Nachman said that in that context where there's a hole, a puncture in the lung, that the animal is going to be a treifa? Because Amar of Yosef Bar Minyomi, Amar of Nachman. So it was quoted in Rav Nachman's name the following statement: Reya shenikva. If you have lungs that had a puncture, the dofin sosam tak sheira, and the wall of the chest cavity closes it up, kshera, it's kosher. Whoa, that statement had no qualifications. So it implies that it's kosher even in the situation where Rav Nachman said that you separate it and you see whether or not you see a problem with the chest cavity. And if you don't see a problem with the chest cavity, then we have to be worried that the problem is with the lungs. And so as a result, the animal is a treifa. But this says no matter what happens if there's a puncture with the lungs and it's now connected and the hole is sealed by being connected to the chest cavity wall. So how can you say that the earlier statement was also said by Rav Nachman? There must be a contradiction here. No, lo kasha, it's not difficult. Hasam b'makom. Now it's interesting because you could have said, the Gemara could have answered, yeah, well, that's a case where there were no blisters. And this is and Rav Nachman's earlier ruling was when there were blisters. So there's no contradiction whatsoever. But that's not the way the Gemara goes, but rather lo kasha. Hasam b'makom revisa. That one is in a place where the chest, where the lungs are naturally likely to be located next to the chest cavity wall. Hacha shelo b'makom revisa. And the other one, where we have to worry that it's not going to be a good seal if we see blisters, that's where it's not in the place of growth. As Rashi tells us, Hasam b'makom revisa, it is basically the middle of maybe a little bit before the middle of the narrow lines in Rashi. Hasam b'makom revisa, b'makom shehariya v'hadofin gadlin ke'echad, in the location where the walls of the chest cavity and the lungs grow together. Usmuchin tamid, and they are always next to one another. Delo mifrakahi sircha. And so now when they become attached in that situation, they will not separate. Hilchak shera. That's why you can have a chest wall sealing of a lung puncture, and the animal will be kosher. V'chi amar Rav Nachman choshishin, and where Rav Nachman said choshishin la lamala, that when he said above that we do have to worry that maybe it's a treifa, birochav hachalal, in the wider part of the chest cavity, keneged ha'uma, opposite the main lobes, uma hagadola, the main lobes of the lungs, to kaven de rechoka ha'reiyam and adofin, because when those lobes are further from the chest cavity wall. So mifrika hahi stima. So as a result, the closure can get removed. Vafilu hachi kilo ha'alasa tzmachim. And nonetheless, Rav Nachman would say that when you don't have blisters, Amar ein choshishin la, the tali la bedofin. When there are no blisters, we can still, even in that wide area, even elsewhere within the lungs and the wall cavity where they aren't growing right next to each other, that we can say that the issue is not with the lungs but with the wall. Ubaha Avimi Sviralan. But we agree with Avimi. Avimi is the one who disagreed with Rav Nachman and said Echad Zeh Echad Zeh Choshishin, that we're going to be worried in both of the situations. The Choshishin law, he's worried even in that situation. Ulachumra Azlinam Bidoraisa. And we, because the command associated with not eating a treifa is a biblical command, we will be worried about his position and hold that way. Okay, so back into the Gemara. So now Gufa. Amar of Yosef Bar Manyume, Amar of Nachman, Reya Shenikva, the Dofin Sosamtak Shera. We just said that if again, this is a statement we had just a few moments ago, that if the lung has a hole and the wall of the chest cavity closes up that hole permanently, so no air can escape, then the animal is going to be kosher. Amaravina, v'hu desvich bevivsara. That is where there is an enmeshing of the meat that is, between the ribs with the hole. And it's not that the chest cavity and the ribs themselves are stuck to the hole, because that's bone being stuck to the hole, and that's different and less likely to be successful. So Amar le Rav Yosef le Ravina. So ve'ilo savach mai treifa. And so if it's not well connected, that it becomes enmeshed, it's going to be a treifa. Alma, so what do we see from that? Amrina nekuvahi. We see that in that context, if you have a lung that is connected to the bone, and therefore it's not enmeshed with the meat associated with the cavity wall, that we're going to treat that lung as if it still has a puncture, as Rashi says, makom. Uh, uh, I'm sorry. The Rashi is the savak bevisra. The savak bevisra shenis beches v'ne'echezet hariya bebasar shebein beis hatzlaot. That when we say that it's connected to the wall, and this maybe actually should have gone earlier. I should have said this Rashi before. We'll do a couple Rashis. That with that when it's enmeshed in the meat, it's talking about the meat that are between the ribs. Dahavi stima shrira, because that creates a strong closure. Delo mifrika, that won't get removed. Aval bitzalaos atzman, but if the thing that is closing up the hole in the lung is the bone itself, and that's where the connection has developed, ein zu sircha kayamis. That is not going to be a stoppage, that a connection that is going to remain, and so that would be a problem. And we said alma nekev, who next Rashi ba'filu hachi kisavich, and nonetheless, when you have an enmeshment, maksheresla, but it's going to be kosher. So alma de mahanya stima l're'il shenakva. Doesn't this show that we now have a rule that where you have a closure of the lung, it is going to be a valid closure? Well, ihachi kisavich nami. But if in fact we're treating the bone lung connection as if there's still a hole, why treat the meat and lung connection as if there's no hole? Dahatanya, because after all, we learned in a brisa, nikav, if you have now this Rashi, next Rashi says, nikav, hagid shel adam. We're talking about a man's member that is, and we're not talking about the context of treifa, but rather there is a rule that somebody that has some kind of mutilation and is unable to have children is not supposed to marry a Jew. And so nikav puzzle. So we say that if somebody's got a hole where they're not supposed to have a hole, they are not able to marry into the Jewish people. Because if he were to have sperm come out, it would go through that hole and it would not actually impregnate the person that the person would marry. So nistam, but if that hole gets closed up, kasher, then he can marry somebody. He has the ability to have children. And this is an invalidity that will return to validity. This is a situation, a rare situation, where you can have something that's not kosher and then it becomes kosher again. But that implies, although obviously that brisa was not talking about this treifa animal where there was a hole in the lung and then it got enmeshed with the meat associated with the lung cavity wall. And then we say that it's no longer considered a hole and therefore the animal is not a treifa. Well, given the fact that we said in this brisa that only this, and that's the implication of vizehu, that only this disqualification goes back to being fit, that implies that our story is not. Vizehu l'ma'utemai. What does zehu come to exclude? Lav l'ma'ute kahai gavna. Isn't it our case of a treifa where the whole of the lung got enmeshed with the meat of the cavity wall and therefore it's no longer a treifa, and so as a result but that brisa is excluding that case, and so really even in that case we should treat the lung as still having the hole and the animal as still being a treifa. So the Gemara responds, "Lo, no, not necessarily. Lema'ute krum Allah machmas maka bereya de'ena krum." No, what it's excluding is the rule that we saw Rav Yosef himself teach on Mem Zayin Amabet, where we say that a scab that forms on the lung is not considered a scab and therefore will not seal the hole, and therefore the animal will remain a treifa. And so we've now come to identify several different situations. And so let's pause for a moment to identify those situations. If you have a simple scab on the lung, well, then that is not going to be something that is permanent, and therefore it will remain a treifa. And if you have the not a scab, but a connection, and the connection is between the walls of the chest cavity and the lung itself, well, then we have to ask: is the connection with bone, or is it an enmeshment with the meat? And if it's with bone, well, then we'll say, just like a regular scab, it's not going to clog the hole, and we have to be worried about it, and therefore it's not going to be a kosher animal. It will remain a treifa. But in the special case of where the enmeshment is between the meat of the chest cavity wall and the wall of the lung, and in that situation, we will say that the hole that is stopped up that way is permanent and will not constitute a treifa. And so those are the different categories on different situations. And I guess we could add to that the situation of the two lobes of the lung that are next to each other, that if they connect to each other, well, then to clog up a hole. If they're next to each other, it will be permanent and will be considered no longer a treifa. Whereas if they're not next to each other, then we still are going to be concerned and it will remain a treifa. Okay, so now we have a question. We're 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 lines up. Last word, second to last word on the line, 8 lines up from where the Gemara gets wide on Memchet Amud Aleph. Maskif lo Rav Ukva Bar Chama. So Rav Ukva asked the following question regarding Rav Nachman's ruling. Ilu inkiv bedofen lahada my trefa. So if it has a hole in the if the chest wall has a hole opposite the hole in the lung, so then it would naturally become a trefa, right? If you think about it, right, you have a hole that was clogged up by the connection between the chest wall and the lung. But now the chest wall itself develops a hole right where the lung had the hole. Well, now the hole that the lung has is effectively going through the chest wall, and so it exists again. So listen, and what caused this treifa? It was the hole in the chest wall. So listening to Kuvas Hadofen. Well, our Mishnah should have mentioned that when you have the kinds of connection that we just described, that where you have a chest wall connected to a hole in the lungs, well, then if you have a hole in the chest wall, that will be a treifa. But we didn't list that in our Mishnah. And our Mishnah seems to be a fully inclusive list. Well, no, it's not. Ulatamech. And so why didn't our Mishnah list it? So ulatamech, I'll ask you a question according to your reasoning. Hada Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that we say that Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mara Shenikva, if you have a gallbladder that has a hole, the kavod so samta kshera, and then the liver seals it, it's going to be kosher. But ilu inkiv kaved lahada my treifa. But what happens if there's a hole in the gallbladder right next to that, opposite that hole in the liver? Doesn't I'm sorry, right? If there's a hole in the liver right opposite where there was a hole in the gallbladder, won't that what'll be about that animal? Treifa. That animal will be a treifa. So listening to Kuvas Hakaved, so we should say in our Mishnah the rule about a punctured liver, even though ordinarily a punctured liver is not enough to be a treifa. You need to have all of the liver removed, or at least all but the kazayas removed, or more than all of the kazayas. Ela ki nikva delav mine mitarfe lokatani. No, the point is that when the main organ has the puncture, and that's the flaw, we're not going to talk about the secondary organ that is now protecting it. That is not going to, we're not going to learn about that situation. So hachinami kevan delav minei mitarfa, that it's not because of the chest wall that the animal is becoming a treifa. It's fundamentally because of the problem with the lung. And so too in the other situation, it wasn't fundamentally a problem with the liver, it was a problem with the gallbladder. So lokatani. So in both situations, we're not going to raise these situations. And that's why our Mishnah didn't mention them. So boy mine Rabba Bar Chana Mishmuel. So Rabba Bar Chana asked of Shmuel, Ha'elsa tzemachin mahu. What is the story with a blisters on the lung? So Amrle Kshera, it's kosher. So Amrle Afani Omer Kane, I agree with you. Elisha Talmidim Mizdanzin bedavar. But the students were uncertain about it. The Amar of Masna, Malya Mugla Trefa, because Rav Masna said that when you have a blister that is filled with pus, it is a trefa. Mayim, Zakim, Kshera. But if it's clear liquid, literally water, but it means a liquid, then it would be kosher. Amar Le, so Shmuel explained, Hahi bekolya itmar. That's not talking about the lungs, blisters on the lungs. That's talking about blisters on the kidneys. But a blister on the lung, it doesn't make a difference what the liquid is that's in it. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef Hava Ka'azel Basrei the Rabbi Yirmiyah Beshuko Detabche. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef was walking behind Rabbi Yirmiyah in the meat market. Chazanu lahanak dekaimu tzimche tzimche, and he saw that there was an animal there that had a lot of blisters. Amar Le, so he says to Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Lo by mar umsa. Don't you want some meat? So Amrle, Leslie Priti, no, I don't have any money. Amrle, Akfanana, I'll lend you. Or I have credit here, so you can buy on my credit. Amrle, ma avidlach. What am I going to do for you? Meaning, dechi asu likamei de Rabbi Yochanan. Because when that kind of case of something filled with blisters, came in front of Rabbi Yochanan, mishader lehu likamei de Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon. He sent it to Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Shimon. Demoriba mishmei de Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon lehetera. And he would rule leniently in the name of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. V'lei lo svirale. But Rabbi Yochanan himself did not actually use this leniency. So as a result, that's why Rabbi Yitzchak, while he's that's why Rabbi Yirmiyah did not want to buy this meat, even when Rabbi Yitzchak offered to allow him to purchase it on credit. Amarava ki haba misaginan basrei de Rav Nachman. Rava said that when he would walk behind Rav Nachman, Bashuka, in the marketplace, and Masiginan, if you take a look at the Rashi, last Rashi on the dot, that's how I know that Masiginan means to walk. Azlinan maske lashon poseya, taking steps. So in that situation, that's so we turn to Memchet Bet Digildai when it was dealing with leather workers, Rashi Ritzoinan, Amri La Beshuka de Rabbanan, and some people say it was the rabbi's marketplace. So Chaze Hanach de Kaime Kande Kande. He saw some lungs that were filled with Kande Kande, and Rashi says Smachim Gedolim. It wasn't just regular blisters; these were big blisters. Kvedim Bereya, that are very heavy, and they were on the lungs. So in that situation, below Amar Lahu, below Midi. And he didn't say anything to the people who were selling it, implying that that would be okay. So Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi havu chalfe b'shuka de Tveria. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi were going through Tveria. Chaze hanach de kaime tinre. And they saw a different kind of blisters. Rashi tells us tinre, smachim gedolim, mikandi. These are even larger blisters than the kandi blisters. The kvar hukshu, and they already became hard. Kisela, like a rock, a stone. Va'elu hein otan hametsuyan bebehema shalanu. And Rashi notes that these kind of blisters are found in our animals, bereya, in their lungs. Ve'ein mar ehen doma l'reya. And they don't appear, the appearance of these blisters is very different from the lung itself. Eladomin kemara mugla, they look like a blister. V'lav hainu atum beria, but they don't cause any stoppage within the lungs. The atum, because if there was a stoppage, ein sham, the atum ein sham, because there's no ein sham sameach. The eno mish the atum ein sham sameach, because a stoppage, there wouldn't be a way to deal with it. Ve'eno mishtaneh min ha're'iyah, and that's a situation where there is no difference. That's not an outer growth, and there's no difference in appearance when you have a stoppage. Ela she'ein ola b'neficha. It's just an indication that you cannot breathe in it. So that's why this is a different situation, even though they'll both involve some kind of hard substance in the lungs. One is on the surface of the lungs, and that's not going to be a problem. And one is in the internal operations of the lungs, and that will be a problem because it stops the breathing. So back into the Gemara. Again, below Amri Luhu, below Midi, and they did not say anything. Apparently, those blisters were still okay, even though they had hardened. So Itmar. Machat shenimtzas bereya. So now we go to begin a series of discussions about needles. We find a needle in the lung. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Chanina, Machshri. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Chanina all say that it's permitted. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbi Mani, Bar Patish, Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim, Tarfe. But Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and others all say it's a treifa. So lema b'hag kamiflagi. Should we say that this is what they're arguing about? Demar savar chisaron mibifnim shmei chisaron. That when you've got something missing inside, and by the very definition of there being a needle inside the lungs, what would have been in that space but for the needle's presence is now missing from the lungs. And so as a result, the opinion that says it's something that it's not kosher would say that that's the reason for the problem. Whereas Umar Savar, the other group, would say lo shmei chisaron. It's not considered a deficiency, and that's why it's not going to be a treifa. Lo, no, that's not the debate. Everybody agrees that it's not considered deficiency if there's something only internal that's wrong. And here's what they're arguing about. Marsavar simpona nakat va'asai. One says that they came through the simpona, the lungs. They were essentially breathed in. V'mar savar nekuve nakiv va'asai. Whereas the others say that no, it came in through the digestive tract and then made its way by making a hole inside on the outer walls of the lung and going inside the lung. And so that's it. It's an indicative of there being a hole in the lung, which is sufficient for being a treifa. So So there was a case where they found a needle in a already cut up lung. So Aitua lekame de Rabbi Ami, and they brought it in front of Rabbi Ami. Savar la'achshura. He thought, well, I'm going to hold like Rabbi Yochanan in the face of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and say that it's kosher. And indeed, Rashi notes there's a two dots that really doesn't have a divrei maskil after it, and it says v'hilchasa kahanach rabbanan demachshere daha Rabbi Yochanan v'reish lakish halacha ka Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Ami was going to hold exactly as Rashi notes that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan and say that it's kosher. But Esvei Rabbi Yirmiyah, but Rabbi Yirmiyah asked him a quick question and said, "V'itema Rabbi Zerika," and some people say it was Rabbi Zerika. Hareya shenikva oshachasra my chasra ilema mibachutz. If you say that so what does it mean to have a hole, to have something missing? Doesn't it mean, and if you say that it means something missing from the outside, hainu nikva, that's the same thing as it having a hole. El lav mivnim, doesn't it mean that that there's something missing inside? Ushmami nach chisaron mibivnim shmei chisaron, and that would teach us that something missing constitutes a deficiency, and therefore the animal should be a treifa. So Hadar Shadrua lekamei de Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. So they sent the lung to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. Savar la'achshura. He also thought to say that it's kosher. Esvei Rabbi Yirmiyah, and the same challenge. V'itema Rabbi Zerika. Hareya shenikva osha chasra, my chasra, ilema mi v'chutz, hainu nikva, elalav mi b'fnim, ushmami nachi saron mi b'fnim, shmei mi chisaron. Can't you use our Mishnah to teach us that there must be something wrong inside? And therefore, if there's a deficiency inside where something's missing, that's enough for the animal to be a treifa. So Hadar Shadrua lekamei de Rabbi Ami. So it was sent back to Rabbi Ami, v'tarfa, and he said it was a treifa. Amrile, v'harabban machshiri. But one second, the rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Chanina, said that the animal was permitted even in a case where a needle was found. Amar lahen, he explained to them. Hein hechshiru shiyodim me'ezet tam hechshiru. They permitted because they knew on what basis they were going to say it's permitted. And Rashi tells us, again, first of all, the Harabanan, what rabbis were we talking about? Dilael, the rabbis that we mentioned, Demakshiri, the ones that said that it was kosher above, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Chanina. And Shiyodin Me'ezet Tamech Shiru, this is the now going into the second wide line at the bottom of Rashi on Memchet Amabet, Shaharei, but Kol Hari'iyah, because they had the entire lung lifneihem. the Ra'ua Shlema, and they were able to see that the entire lung was whole. Hilkach al karchach derech hakana nifnasa. And so as a result, that's how come they could say that it came in through the trachea. So again, what we end up having is the following distinction. We have when you have the entire lung in front of you and you find a needle in the lung and you are able to check the walls of the lung and you don't see any other defect, well, then we will follow Rabbi Yochanan's teaching and say that it came in, even though it might be unlikely, using, I guess you could call it the principle that Sherlock Holmes principle, that if you've eliminated all possible outcomes, whatever's left, however unlikely it may be, is must be the explanation. And so as a result, we've eliminated all other possible explanations. It didn't come through the walls of the lung into this location. It must be that it was breathed in, and that's how it came into the lung. And so as a result, that's the situation. And so that's where we'll permit it. But anon, but we're looking at a lung that was already cut up. Me'ezetam nachshir. What basis? Back into the Gemara, I should have said. But we're looking at it at a that now we're in the second of the Y lines in the middle of the line. Anan me'ezetam machshire. What's the basis that we could say that it's going to be kosher? Makshir, rather. So Dilma, I hava reya kaman minakva. Maybe if we actually had the full lung in front of us, we would see the hole that the needle came through after puncturing the esophagus and puncturing the outer lung. It would have come through that hole, and we would be able to know that in fact this is a treifa. And so that's why I have to rule that this is a treifa. So Tema delesa. Taima delesa. So the bottom line is that the reason that Rabbi Ami said it's prohibited is because there wasn't a surface to check here. Ha-isa, velo minakva. But if there was here and it didn't have a hole, kshera, it would be kosher. V'amar Rav Nachman, hai simpona dereya de inkiv treifa. But 1 second, Rav Nachman says that even if you have a bronchial tube that has a hole in it, it's considered a treifa. And this needle was found inside the lung. And so even if it didn't puncture the outer surface of the lung, it got there by way of the bronchial tubes. And so as a result, it must have punctured a bronchial tube. So no, hahu lechavera itmar. When Rav Nachman said that a hole in the bronchial tube is going to make the animal a treifa, that is where a bronchial tube was punctured at a point next to another tube, meaning that there are a variety of branches where it is true. And so let's take a look at Rashi. 1, 2, 3, 4 lines into the Y lines of Rashi at the bottom of Menchet Amabet. Lechaveru itmar, end of the line. Now on to the 5th line. Eitzel pitzel, next to the branches. Kishamispatzel. So when you have the branches of the bronchial tubes breaking off from one another, and one of them has a hole very close to where it broke off from another tube, Nikav Eitzel Dofin Shel Chavero, and the hole is near the wall of a nearby bronchial tube. To Kaven to Dofin Chaveru Kasher, because those tubes are very hard next to it, and who Dirish Bilaz, and it's called Dirish Bilaz, Omid Kenegdo, it will stand opposite it, the Sota Manekib, and it will not move and create a closure to close off the hole. The low Maginala, and so it won't protect it. Aval Nikav La'achar Pitzulo Berchok Basar Hariya. But if in fact the hole that this needle created was far away from the branches, Shehu Rach, where everything is softer, Nichnas Lenekev, the other branches will go into the hole, Umagin Alav, and will and protect it. V'halo Amrinan, Dilma Inkev Lechavre De'achazuke Riusa Lo Mechazkinan. Because the bottom line, and we're not going to assume that this is the problem, because we don't have any basis to make that assumption. Ilo itchazik kagon hecha de lesa l're'iyah. Come on, unless we can't prove anything about it because we don't have the lung in front of us. The alkane chazaka hi sharov hanivlain ein nivlain ela derech haveshet. When we don't have anything in front of us, well, then we have to assume that maybe it came in through the esophagus. Umisham lo yatsa b'toch hariyah, and below nikivas dakin varia, and then you wouldn't be able to have it go into the lungs without it creating a small hole in the lungs. And so the fact that we don't have it and therefore can't show that that doesn't exist is why we have to be worried in that situation. But when the lung's in front of us and when we don't see any holes in the outer rim of the lung, well, then we can hold like Rabbi Yochanan. So, Vahamar of Nachman, ha hai hadura dekanta de inkve de inkiv lahade chabre megan ale. But one second, Rav Nachman has in a different context when you have the circles of the intestine and you have a hole in one of the in one place in the intestine, we say that another hole, another wrapping of the intestine can protect it. So why not say the same thing about bronchial tubes? So Amar Rav Ashi, Trefos kamidami lahadadi ein omrim betrefa zu domalazu. You're going to try and compare one trefa to another one. We don't compare one trefa to another. Sharei chodcha mikan umesa chodcha mikan v'chaya. Because you can have one cut of an animal and it could become a treifa, and another cut of an animal and it would be a non-treifa. And what are we talking about? Take a look at Rashi, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom of Rashi near the end of the line. Shaharei chodcha mikan umesa v'chodcha mikan v'chaya. Nechtach basar raglayim. If the meat, if the flesh of the leg has been cut lemala mitzomas hagidin, above the junction of the sinews within the leg, well then below nishbar ha'etzim, without breaking any bones, kshera, you know what? That animal is kosher. If it's above, meaning more of the leg has been cut off, it's going to be kosher. It's not going to be a treifa. However, nechta cholamata, but if the cut happens exactly where these sinews come together, b'makom tzomas hagidin, afal pi shenamoch mikan, even though it's below it and less is being cut from the animal, treifa, then the animal will be a treifa. As we are going to see, as we're going to see on Daf Ayin Vavam and Aleph, even though the bone does not get cut. So that's the quote associated with this language. And the bottom line is that you can't use rules of logic in connection with treifas. Basically, everything has to be a tradition that has been handed down to us. So we had a needle found in the sympona, in the main bronchial tubes. I'm sorry, the sympona raba dureya, in the large bronchial tubes of the lungs. Asyua lekamei de rabban trophai. So they brought it in front of the rabbis, and it was ruled a treifa. Lo amriba ella lo isar velo heter. But they did not say anything about it regarding. I'm sorry. My apologies. That asyua lekamei de rabbanan trophai. They brought it in front of rabbis who said that the case before that we had was a treifa. So lo amruba lo iser velo heter, and they did not say anything about this needle in this particular case. Heter lo amre ba kishmai taihu. They didn't say that it was permitted because they themselves had said it was prohibited, right? The three rabbis, Rish Lakish, etc., they were the ones who said that it was prohibited. And Iser Nami Lo Amri Ba, but they also didn't say it was prohibited, Kevin de Simpona Rabba Ishtakach, because they realized that it was found in the main bronchial tube. And so Ema Simpuna Nakat Va'asai. Maybe that way, in that situation, it's more clear that it came in that manner, and therefore they were uncertain about that situation. And so that is where we will end for today. And God willing, we'll pick up with more cases of embedded needles, God willing, tomorrow. Looking forward to continuing our learning together. Tomorrow, update. Charlie Hall has volunteered to teach, God willing, tomorrow and Friday. So hopefully he will be here at 7:45 on Zoom. Looking forward to learning with all of you. And I will look forward to being back, God willing, next Thursday. So I will be back on June 25th and looking forward to learning with you all again at that time. Wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the week and have a fabulous day.